Welcome to Canonical, the podcast that takes literature out of the classroom. I'm James Shao, and with me are my co-hosts, Iad Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hey, Sam.
Hey, Ian.
Welcome back. Today we are continuing our discussion of Ali Smith's There But For the second book in our series, A Novel in Stories. Today's discussion may contain spoilers, so be warned. Can we spoil this book? I guess there are spoilers.
Yeah, I think there are.
But the Guardian review spoils like everything. Like I read the Guardian review, they didn't hide anything about the novel.
No holds barred.
Yeah, I feel like that reviewer just doesn't give a fuck. If this is your first time joining us, we are a literary book club on Reddit. You can join our discussion there by clicking on the link in the episode description. You can support us and your local bookstore by using our bookshop.org link. That's also in the episode description. And we are on social media at Canonical Pod. So, Sam, tell us about one of these Guardian reviews.
Yeah, speaking of The Guardian, one of those reviewers mentions that the dinner party guests who didn't know that Black people with Yorkshire accents probably did not originate from a place with tigers, that idea strained credulity, and that there were other similar exchanges throughout the book. And I don't think I agree. I think I've met some pretty clueless people, but I get what the reviewer was trying to say with that. But I'll pose to you, how much does credulity matter in a relatively realistic novel like this?
I think it does matter in a realist novel, but I did not find this to strain my credulity because I just assume all Black people deal with tigers. Like, what's wrong with that? Why are we strained?
I was strained because it's a kind of satire, right? Like, Smith is obviously a liberal, and she's writing conservative characters. And the way that she writes this conflict between liberal and conservative ideology is very broad. And you might even say unfair to the conservative portions of her readership if they exist, because they are kind of being strawmanned here, right? Like, she's making them perhaps more ridiculous than they are. Now, like Sam, I think there are actually this level of ridiculous people out there, but perhaps it's not an argument in good faith. But it doesn't really matter. And the reason why is I don't think that it's a novel that treats these characters as human beings, but as archetypes. So what they actually do doesn't really matter if it matches real people in the real world, because I think what she wants to do is just point to people and say, this character is this type of person. And I think that the novel is able to do that pointing. I think it's effective.
I think you're right in that I think it is dealing with archetypes. James, you mentioned that there are some characters that get really fleshed out, while there are others that are more just archetypal. But I think, while in some ways, maybe it's not fair to treat certain characters as these flat, comical archetypes, this is the same world where Archie Bunker, the character from, what was that, The Honeymooners?
All in the Family.
All in the Family? Damn.
Don't even know who this guy is. White people telling me about things I don't know.
Archie Bunker was a character who was very much this conservative archetype with really backward ideas. And he was a central character on this show from the, 60s maybe?
I think All in the Family was from the 70s.
Is that right? It's that wow. Pretty much this character just said all the wrong things all the time. And it was supposed to be very funny. But what ended up happening was a lot of the country, a lot of the US saw Archie Bunker and went, yeah, that guy knows what he's talking about. And they took it just at straight face value. So I don't think this is really straining that much credulity. But I think you are right that it doesn't really matter either way, because these are not necessarily supposed to be fully fleshed out characters.
So there is a character in the book who is an obviously fake psychic, right? She or he sells messages from Milo to people who are willing to go into her or his tent. I don't remember the gender of this person. I mean, that's obviously an archetype, and it's, it doesn't get a lot of page space, but do you think that's more or less problematic as like this conservative drone seller or whatever that guy does for a living?
I think it matters how the character is being used in the story. That person, I don't think, was being used as a punching bag in the same way that Richard, the conservative drone salesman, was. And when you fight against people and you misrepresent their viewpoints, it doesn't feel fair. Like, if it's not a fight, then it doesn't matter if it's not really faithful to real life. I think what matters most is that there are people like this in the world. Not exactly like this, but generally like this. One of the first episodes that we did for this podcast is a review of a novel, Convenience Store Woman. And that also felt unbelievable. But I think the difficulty that I had with that novel is it was pointing to a kind of person that I think doesn't exist in the real world. I think the idea that such a person would exist is itself an exaggeration. And that's what made it difficult for me to understand that novel. I don't think that in terms of Ali Smith's world, all conservatives are like Richard, the drone salesman, but there are some of them out there. And because there are some, we get enough of that pointing gesture that I was looking for.
I think it doesn't matter really in a different sense, not just that these are archetypal characters, but I don't think this is really trying to be all that realistic. It's realism in that we don't have flying saucers and wizards and things like that, but it's very absurd in that, in most cases, if you had someone, especially an invitee of an invitee, staying at your house and refusing to leave, you wouldn't care about the 18th century door. You would just find a way to get them to leave no matter what. So I don't think it's really trying for true realism. I think Convenience Store Woman is a kind of good analog because that also dealt with archetypes to a degree. But while Marra, the author, has some real similarities to that protagonist in the novel, I don't think we were supposed to read her or anyone in particular in that role. So I don't think that book was striving for realism in the same way that this one isn't really striving for realism. That they both take place in our world, but I don't know how important it is that Marra's protagonist, or whatever the male character is, the kind of foil for her, I don't know how important it is that those are based on real people or not.
I think this is the same thing, though, that I said when we talked about Convenience Store Woman, is that I think that that book has something to say about Japanese society. And for any sort of social critique to land, it has to have some grain of truth. Otherwise, it's just talking about some alien society, and it's meaningless to me. And I think that There But For The has a politics to it. It has a statement about the world that we live in inside of it. And for that to work, there has to be some grain of truth. It's not entirely realistic, but I think in the places where it matters, there is that kernel of truth.
I think one of the factors that contribute to this feeling of punching down is the book is a satire, but it's not a satire at all moments and for all characters. It's a satire for most of the characters, except for the main characters who are the focus of the chapters. Like, I don't think anyone would say May was a caricature of anyone. She is very clearly a fleshed out character. All 4 chapters deal with fleshed out characters. Miles is not satirized, but he is in a ridiculous situation. I think he's kind of on the borderline in that way, where he feels like a real person, but at the same time, he's doing something absurd. But there are other characters who are very clearly just archetypes and are being skewered. And so it creates this feeling that there are people who are in the in group, people who are real people, and the people who are in the out group. Can we say in the out group? That sounds weird. People who are not in the in group.
People who are out.
I mean, those people, because they are out, that's not the right word either, because we're dealing with homosexuality here. But anyway, the people who are not in the in group, it feels like those people are being victimized, kind of, because they're being satirized. And it's almost everybody.
Do you feel that they're actually being victimized, though?
No, I don't care about them. Victimize them as much as you want, Ali Smith. I have a question, though. How does this relate to, like, what is the bigger issue here? when you ask about credulity. Like, how does it relate to empathy? It's sort of like, well, what's the importance of this credulity or of this realism? Is Smith saying that there should be empathy for some, but not for all? Because she characterizes some of the characters, the main characters, with empathy, but the other characters are satirized.
I think, like I said before, that the message here is about being kind and being fair to other people and understanding their lives. But there is no effort made to do that with Richard the drone salesman. So, is there a message that the story is telling that's at odds with the way the story is being told?
And you could also say Jen, right? Because she's not treated very kindly and her husband leaves her and she's left with all these things she can't sell.
I think there's a self-awareness that is given to certain characters. And I think we find that in real life also. You can say that maybe they're not being treated fairly, but I think if they were more self-aware...
It's their fault. I agree.
Sure. I don't think the point is that they should be treated unkindly. I think the point is that those people treat others unkindly, or at least without a certain self-awareness. And that in order to be treated kindly, you also have to treat your neighbors kindly. Building off of that, what do you think is the theme of this book?
I think the theme is about being a decent person in a world that is making it very difficult for you to be decent to yourself and to others.
I think the theme is not about being a decent person. I think it's about communication and the stories we tell ourselves and how we build bridges.
Can't they both be correct?
No, Sam, you can't. No, it's one or the other, Sam. What's your position? Tell us why we're wrong.
I think the point is that there is always a story behind where people come from, what their histories are. So the more you know about those stories, maybe the more empathy you can have for them. But the point is that maybe you should just be kind to everyone instead of only the people that you know things about.
But not to the drone salesman.
Well, no, fuck that guy.
Or the guy scamming you.
But everyone else. But what I really want to get to is the title. How does this title, There But For The, relate to those themes?
I think it's kind of direct. I mean, the expression that people use is there but for the grace of God go I. So when do people say that? What do they mean? It's like, I'm moving along through the world, but not because I've earned the ability to move along, but because God is gracious enough to allow me to continue living. So it's kind of a gesture of humility, right?
Right. But it's a gesture of humility when looking at someone else.
Yeah, because you're looking at someone who's less fortunate and saying, I could also be that less fortunate person. But thankfully, God has plucked me out of that circumstance. And that person has to poop on themselves or whatever.
Right. I think we see this in all of the stories. Anna, I think we don't see it as much with her specifically, but the people around her. And everyone else, I think it's a little more direct than that.
Well, I think you should vote for Kang and not Kodos. And this is obviously about communication because each word in the title refers to a different chapter, obviously. So that's why it's important. That's the theme of the book, right? The focus on the language. And also, there's this pause in the action there, but for the pause, grace of God go I. I think it's important that there is this pause before the grace of God go I, because the story is about the pauses in life.
No, I think you're wrong. I think it's what he had said.
It's definitely about the pauses in life. You do have the present tense, right? Obviously in the story, but so much of it takes place in the past via flashback, and it's about how important it is to consider the past when thinking about how or why a person is the way they are in the present. And I think this interruption in this phrase, there but for the space, grace of God go I, is forcing you to think about the pause, the division between going forward, like go I, right? I think it's actually quite important. It's a pause in the action. It's forcing you to think about the past.
You skipped over Anna, but I think Anna fits into that kind of humility reading because in her teenage story, she goes on this trip of Europe and her difficulty is relating to the other teenagers because she's from Scotland, everyone else is from England, and she just assumes that she can't get along with them because they're from England. Fair enough. But when she meets Miles, she finally realizes that people from a different place with a different idea of home can still be kind to her. So he's kind of disabusing her of her prejudice against the English.
Well, let's pause talking about Anna. When we come back, we'll talk about refugees. We'll be right back. Welcome back. So, Sam, you're going to tell us how refugees are related to this.
This was published in 2011, and the Arab Spring began roughly at the end of 2010, though I think we have been in what has been called a refugee crisis, especially in Europe, since well before that. Do you see, first of all, any sort of connection? I feel like I see the connections clearly, but speaking with you guys off mic, it sounds like that is coming from left field. So do you see any connections at all?
I see it. I think that the novel is about being decent towards other people. And I think part of that decency comes from empathy and understanding that people could have a very different life from yours, but have trouble in their life that you can help them with. And isn't that part of helping refugees?
I see it related similarly to Iad in that it's a subset of helping others, but it's not the focus. Like Anna has this as her job. She helps refugees. But I don't think you would read this book and say, okay, this book is about this woman who helps refugees. You'd say that this book is about how we relate to each other and what we understand about each other, even across a chasm of difference.
I think that's fair. Let me zoom out a little bit. What do you think the book is saying about borders or the visible versus invisible divisions between people or states?
I think you can see it kind of in the action that Miles takes when he takes over this room. I mean, he's not exactly a refugee, but in the story, you do understand him as a victim of sorts, even though at the beginning of the story, he's seen or portrayed as an aggressor of sorts because he's taking over someone's room. And isn't that the quandary of a refugee? That they themselves have been victimized and they need to seek refuge. But by doing so, by seeking refuge, they take, quote, someone else's space and they become, quote, an aggressor.
Right. That is the argument anyway.
So he violates the border or the social norm of how you should not take over someone else's bedroom and decides to stay for, half a year or whatever.
Yeah, it's kind of extending the argument from a more theoretical standpoint to this very literal, immediate sense.
If we do understand this as a metaphor for a refugee, the conceit is not elaborated upon because it becomes this spectacle where people treat him as a messiah. And what they do is they put onto him more meaning than perhaps what he is bearing, just from what you know about his personal life. Like, he's certainly not trying to be a messiah. So I think this kind of understanding of him as a refugee gets diluted because the sort of fanfare around him is not the kind of fanfare you expect about a refugee. So she doesn't really run with this metaphor. I think she establishes it, but it's not a conceit that is carried throughout the book if you look at the external reaction to him doing what he did.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that what he does, you can read it as being parallel to what refugees do, but I wouldn't say that it's really making him out to be similar to refugees because his status in the world is very much different, and his status in their household is very much different from the refugee status in their new host country.
That's true. So then what is she saying about that status? What is she saying by using Miles in this way? If it's not a conceit that's borne out fully, what is she saying with Miles?
I think this is something that we'll probably talk about a little bit more next week, but I think that you could potentially see it more as a kind of protest, maybe like a sit-in, rather than a refugee, because I don't think he ever intended to stay in the spare room forever. He wasn't finding a new home. He wasn't saying that I have as much a right to the spare room as you do. So there wasn't this kind of displacement or any sort of claim to territory. I think it's very difficult for me to imagine how, Smith is connecting this to refugees because I really doubt that that was her intention.
Well, then let's go back to the idea about borders and divisions, because I think those are maybe more central. I think there are images that she uses that are borne out a little more clearly. For example, at that dinner party, when Richard says that the world is more or less borderless, Brooke, the precocious child, says that that's except for the borders where they check your passport for hours. And I think it's later in the book where we see when she and her family, I don't remember how detailed it is. I think they come back into the country from a trip or something, and they get pulled aside.
Yeah, I don't think it's explained where they went, but they were in customs waiting for a long time. And then the customs officer says, okay, you can go.
Right, without any explanation. And this kind of goes back to what something we talked about last week. But why have that in the book?
I think that it's, again, kind of like the question of to whom do we have a duty of kindness? How do we need to treat other people? And you could say that as Britons returning to Britain, they shouldn't be hassled when they're passing through customs. As people with a different skin color from most of the other British people around them, they shouldn't be hassled. And in one sense, we could extend this not only to them as British subjects, but to everybody. Like everybody has the same duty of care or the same duty of kindness to other people.
It's tough for me to pull these different pieces apart because I think Smith does a good job of not beating you over the head with ideas, as we discussed last week, and giving some nuance. For example, Richard, in that same discussion, counters with, yes, but everywhere needs some defense against people just coming in and overrunning the place with their terrorisms or their deficiencies. And while that's clearly gross, we have a world that already has these borders in place. What is Smith's point? Is Smith's point that we shouldn't have these borders? Is Smith's point that we don't need the CCTV cameras pointed everywhere?
In that particular scene, I think it's just to point out the boorishness and the hypocrisy of conservatives. They say one thing until they're shown to be wrong, and then they very quickly say the opposite. I think, again, it's just a case of her not really playing fairly, because this is kind of a turnabout that's almost hyperbolically exaggerated, Like, yeah, there are people who perhaps would say such a thing, but do they represent the majority? Maybe not.
I suppose not, but it does remind me of conversations, arguments that I've heard that have come up fairly recently in different contexts when the idea of using drones on our own soil to monitor people. I remember people discussing, if you don't have anything to hide, why should you worry? If you're not doing anything wrong, what's the problem? That question isn't asked here specifically, but it's the same kind of, I guess, ridiculous, hyperbolic question that is made to shut people up instead of have a real discussion.
Are you saying that in this scene, Richard is saying this to shut Brooke up?
I don't know that he is. I think boorish is the right term. I don't think he's to bring up the term I used earlier, self-aware enough. I don't think he gets when Terrence is making fun of him, for example. I think he's very interested in what he does, and he doesn't see the problem at all with surveilling people or creating walls. He doesn't seem to have a problem with invasion of privacy. I want to point out another example in the book of divisions. This takes place in Greenwich, England, where the Prime Meridian runs. And that's clearly a invisible division. And we have a scene of Brooke dancing back and forth over that line, where at one point she's in one time zone and another point she's in another time zone. What is that doing for the book? How is Smith playing with that invisible division in the face of other divisions that she uses?
I think she's pointing to the hypocrisy that we are very willing to play with how artificial that division is, but we are very serious when it comes to other artificial divisions, like the divisions between nations or the divisions between cultures.
Is it too ridiculous for her to use Miles in this way, invading someone's home? While it's easy to dislike Jen, and I guess her husband, who isn't as much of a force, why is it so easy to dislike them when really this is a really ridiculous situation?
To be honest, I didn't dislike them particularly. I thought of them as kind of pathetic characters, perhaps limited in their worldview, but I didn't dislike them in the way that I disliked Richard. I think that your reading of Miles's action is probably different from mine because I am imagining that you see a more specific reason for what he has done. And for me, I think that his reasoning is much less pointed. It's much more of a general ennui or a state of unsettled feelings that he feels at that moment during the dinner party. And that's why he has excused himself and gone to the bedroom.
I think you're right. I don't think there's a particular reason for him doing this.
Well, can we speculate on what we think the reason might be? Because I agree that it's not stated, but why? Like, why does he do it? I know you're saying a general ennui, but what's the ennui?
I think that in general, he sees the people at dinner talking past each other, and people who are kind of fossilized into their worldview talking to each other in ways where they don't really realize that they're not talking to each other and not really listening to what other people are saying to them. And that to me, I think is very frustrating to him because I think his role in the novel is as perhaps not a supremely empathetic person, but a person who is remarkably more empathetic than the others that he encounters. We'll talk more about him next week, but I do think that the specifics of what he is saying or perhaps gesturing towards is probably a better way because I don't think he's articulating anything specific, but I think what he's doing means something to other people around him.
This is a little bit of a change of pace, but it's something I've been thinking about in terms of this question, and I'm trying to relate it in my head. There's a pun on the name of the dinner party hosts, Jen and Eric.
Generic?
Okay.
I didn't catch it.
Yeah, I didn't catch it either.
So maybe this question is meaningless then. But how does that fit into this at all? Or is it just a joke?
I don't think that they are articulated as completely as a character like Anna or a character like Mark are articulated and characterized. So for them to be generic makes sense because they are archetypes. They represent a certain sort of values that I think, Smith does it pretty effectively because you know what kind of people they are.
So is that a commentary on the kind of people they are? The fact that they can be so flat, so generic? Or is that taking it a step too far?
It's tough to say because I feel kind of the same way as I do about Richard. Richard is treated as this kind of flat character, and the flatness of the characterization runs contrary to what I'm reading as the theme of the novel. So it's difficult for me to square these two things. But I don't think it's problematic that they are generic. I think that as long as there is something that Smith expects to find in her readers' minds, and she can point to it and say, these are these kinds of people that you have met before. As long as that connection can be made, it works.
I think it's an interesting turn, a couple of interesting turns. One, that she started obviously, wanting him out, and then at the end she wants him to stay. And it kind of speaks to the effect that Miles has on people. And two, the fact that they get divorced, which I think is actually kind of important. Or if not divorced, they decide to split up, which also is a result of what Miles did, I think.
Your first point about Jen wanting him to stay, you put it in terms of Miles's effect on people. I think that's more to my larger point about this refugee status, is that she only wants him to stay for superficial reasons, for her own gain.
Well, she wants him to stay to exploit him.
Right. So it's not really the force of his personality. You might even say she doesn't want Miles to stay. She wants Milo to stay.
All right, let's stop here. Thank you for listening. You can find us on Reddit and on social media at Canonical Pod. If you'd like to support us and your local bookstore, you can use our bookshop.org link. That's in the episode description. And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can give us a review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. Next week, we'll be back with more discussion of Therefore But the. We'll be back with more Miles and Milo next week with Smith's There But For The.
The dessert course is coming up next week.
Yeah. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.